this tutorial is an extension of the real numbers tutorial, and it's going to specifically focus on the properties of real numbers. So here is a list of 4 of the main properties that are used in Algebra 2. So we have associative, commutative, inverse, and identity. Now they're each going to have a property used in addition and a property used in multiplication. And an example for associative would look something like this. So say we have 3 plus 2 in parentheses minus 7. Well, based on the associative property, that's going to equal the same thing as doing 3 plus parentheses 2 minus 7. So as you can see here, the 3 plus 2 minus 7 is the same on both sides. It's just that for this side, we have the parentheses around 3 plus 2, and over here we have the parentheses around 2 minus 7. Now, if you notice, the answer here and the answer over here are going to be the exact same. Here we have 5 minus 7, which is a negative 2, and here we have a 3 plus a negative 5, which is also a negative 2. So here we can see that it doesn't matter where the parentheses are here, we're always going to end up with the same answer. Now similarly with multiplication, say we had 3 times 2 times 7, that's going to be the same thing as doing 3 times 2 and then times 7. So here, for example, 2 times 7 is 14, and then times 3 is 42. Now here, 3 times 2 is 6, and 6 times 7 is 42. So again, it doesn't matter where these parentheses are. They could be right here for the 2 times 7, or right here for the 3 times 2. It's still going to give us the same answer because of the associative property. Now, an example of the commutative property, in addition, we could use 1 plus 8. Now 1 plus 8 under the commutative property is the same exact thing as 8 plus 1. Now obviously 1 plus 8 is 9 and 8 plus 1 is 9. So under the commutative property, these two are the exact same thing. Now similarly with multiplication, say we had 2 times 3, that's going to be the exact same thing as 3 times 2. So based on the commutative property, 2 times 3 is going to be 6, and 3 times 2 is also going to be 6. The order doesn't matter. Now, for example, with inverse, an inverse with addition occurs when you have a number being added with its inverse. So for example, 4, and the inverse of 4 would be a negative 4. That's going to equal 0. So when you have 4 plus its inverse, you'll get 0. And that's true for any number. If you had 7 and added it to its inverse, you should get 0. Now with multiplication, it's slightly different, but it's a similar idea. If we had 4 and then multiplied it by its multiplicative inverse, that would be 1/4. So if we do 4 times 1/4, we'll get 1. So a multiplicative inverse is when you take the number times its multiplicative inverse. So 4, or in other words 4 over 1, times its inverse, it's like taking the same number but flipping the numerator and denominator, should equal 1, which it does. 4 times 1 is 4, 1 times 4 is 4, and then 4 divided by 4 gives you 1. Now identity, for addition, say we had 7 plus 0, that's just going to be 7. So pretty much when you have an equation that involves adding or subtracting a 0, you're going to be left with whatever number you started with. That's known as the identity property. Now for multiplication it's similar, except instead of adding we're going to be multiplying. So say if we have a 7 and then we ended up needing to multiply it by 1, that's still going to be 7. So if you take any number and multiply it by 1, you're going to have a result of that same exact number you started with. That would be the identity property for multiplication. Now there's a property that you may be familiar with, but it uses both addition and multiplication at the same time, and that would be the distributive property. So with the distributive property, for example, say we have something like 3 times 2 plus 4. Well, according to the distributive property, that's the exact same thing as doing 3 times 2 and then adding it with 3 times 4. So we just take this number and multiply it to the first number in parentheses and then add it to the product of it and the second number in the parentheses. So this would give us 6 and then plus 12, which is the same thing as 18. Well, 3 times 6 is also 18. So we know this to be true as well. Now that we have a good idea of the different properties of real numbers, let's take a look at some examples. So here we have a list of some equations, and we want to see what property they are using. So here with the first one, we have 5 times 8 equals 8 times 5. So here we have 5 times 8, and it should equal the same thing in reverse order. That would be an example of using the commutative property when using multiplication. Now here we have negative 34 plus 0 equals negative 34. Well, if you take a number and add 0 to it, you're still going to get the same number when you're doing addition. That would be an example of using the identity property with addition. Now, but this third one, it uses multiplication and addition. For example, we have 3 times the quantity 7 plus 10, and that should equal 21 plus 30. So if you notice, 3 times 7 with distributing will give us a 21, and then plus 10 times 3 will give us our plus 30 here. So when we distribute this 3 to both of these, we'll end up getting 21 plus 30. So that would be an example of using the distributive property. Now this fourth one, we have 4 times 0.25 equals 1. Now if you remember with multiplication, if you take a number and multiply it by its inverse, you should get 1. Now here with 0.25, another way of writing it would be 1/4. And 1/4 is the multiplicative inverse of 4. So if you do 4 times its inverse, 1/4, you'll get 1. So this would be an example of using the inverse property. Now this last one, we have 22 plus the quantity of negative 10 plus 4. And that should equal the quantity of 22 minus 10 plus 4. So here when you're using addition, if it doesn't matter where these parentheses are, then you'd be using the associative property.